Something started going wrong at the movies in the 2020s. Movies that were supposed to be successful and had hundreds of millions poured into them either flopped or disappointed, while movies with half the resources did gangbusters. For more than a decade, Hollywood had bet it all on sequels, but suddenly the bet isn't looking so sure anymore. Film franchises that were once solid bets suddenly had releases that were doing hundreds of millions of dollars less than previous installments. Aquaman 2 made $700 million less than the first Aquaman, while The Rise of Skywalker made nearly $1 billion less than The Force Awakens. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, meanwhile, made less than the budget, meaning it fell nearly $600 million short of breaking even. Thanks to their broad recognition, Disney was the most obviously brutalized, but no major studio was unscathed. So what happened? Why did the formula stop working, and what happens next? The funny thing is that, historically, something like this happened before, and I think there might actually be a good outcome out of all of this. First, we'll look at why sequels are a thing, why the 2010s specifically were the decade of sequels, what happened that caused the decline in the box office, and what happens next. Before we get into the issue, it's important to understand the road that led to the intense focus on sequels. Now, everyone knows that Hollywood makes so many sequels because sequels make so much money. But people throw this around as an abstract notion. We need to quantify just how important sequels are to the movie industry and just how much money they make because it is ungodly. One adage held true in the 2010s, that sequels equaled success. Not just immediate sequels like Iron Man 3 after Iron Man 2, but even sequels that happened a decade or more after the previous installment, like Jurassic World and Star Wars The Force Awakens, both in 2015. To put it in perspective, these are the 10 highest grossing movies of the 2010s. There are only two non-obvious sequels here, Black Panther and The Lion King, but I don't count them as wholly original either. Black Panther was already introduced in Captain America Civil War and relied on the overall success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I want to pause for a quick moment to stress just how original the MCU was at that point, because it's also a huge part of the sequelization of the 2010s. There have been plenty of movie series like Harry Potter, The Lord of the Rings, and James Bond, but there really wasn't anything like the shared universe of the MCU, which brought in characters from disparate mainline movies. That's not to say cinematic universes didn't exist. There were some, like the Universal Monsters, Toho's Godzilla, and Alien vs. Predator, and crossovers have long been a thing, but none of them standardized it like the MCU did. By attaching the MCU name to a property, it automatically boosted its box office. Alright, quick moment over. The Lion King can't really be counted as original either, as it was a remake of one of the most successful animated movies of all time, but with CGI instead of 2D animation. While it was a technical marvel, it lacked the charm that the 2D brought to the original, and most certainly relied on the nostalgia factor. If we were to expand this list to top 20, the story doesn't change. Frozen would be the only true original film on the list then. If we expand it to the top 30, the story hardly changes yet again. There's Aquaman and Joker, but as Aquaman was part of the DCEU, only Joker remains as a truly original film. That means that a whopping 2 of the 30 highest grossing movies of the 2010s were original, and even then they relied on the powerful branding of Disney and DC. The box office total for these 30 movies was $41.6 billion, and sequels accounted for $39.2 billion of that, or 94%. A quick sidebar, I'm using the top 30 as a cutoff because even if I expand it to the top 50, the story doesn't change. Zootopia, Bohemian Rhapsody, and The Secret Life of Pets would be the only other inclusions. Everything else was a sequel, prequel, or remake. But what a difference a decade makes, because the 2000s were wildly different. Whereas only 2 out of the 30 highest grossing movies of the 2010s were original, a whopping 10 of the 30 highest grossing movies of the aughts, or 33%, were original. Now there are some obvious caveats to make clear. Several of these were based on very popular existing books, but none of them were able to leverage an already existing filmic universe. Basically, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, had to work a lot harder than, say, Aquaman to be successful, because the last attempt was an animated film from the 1970s, while Aquaman had help from the already established DCEU. The box office total for the 30 highest grossing movies of the aughts was $27.5 billion. Of this $27.5 billion, $17.6 billion was from sequels, or 64%. While sequels were important in the 2000s, they weren't as important as they were in the 2010s. But even the 2000s number of original films pales in comparison to the 90s, when a now shocking 26 of the 30 highest grossing movies were original movies, most without any caveats. The only non-original ones were Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, The Lost World, Jurassic Park, Terminator 2, Judgment Day, and Toy Story 2. If you really want to, you can also include 1998's Godzilla, though this was the first American Godzilla film since 1956's Godzilla King of the Monsters, even though that one only had spliced in footage from an American actor. Regardless, the vast majority of the most successful movies of the 90s were, in fact, original movies. Movies like The Matrix, The Sixth Sense, Men in Black, and Independence Day didn't rely on anything except great filmmaking and, in the case of Independence Day, the best movie speech of all time.
We will not go quietly into the night. We will not vanish without a fight. We're going to live on. We're going to survive. Today, we celebrate our Independence Day.
Movies like Jurassic Park and Titanic could rely on the brands of Steven Spielberg and James Cameron, already iconic directors, but that's about it. The top 30 movies of the 1990s made $21.7 billion, and only $2.5 billion of that was from sequels, or around 11%, compared to 64% in the 2000s and 94% in the 2010s. Now, these are broad comparisons, and I would be remiss to not mention that the average ticket price of movies has only been going up. 3D and PLFs, or premium large formats such as RPX at Regal, Dolby Cinema at AMC, and IMAX in a lot of places are even more expensive. This is somewhat, but not completely, offset by the fact that there are thousands of fewer theaters to go to now than there were in the 1990s or 2000s. The biggest impact on theatrical film, though, has undoubtedly been the rise of streaming, which really began in the early 2010s and, in a decade, has become how most people watch film and TV. In the late aughts and early 2010s, when streaming met Netflix or Hulu, virtually all of the content was licensed, not original. To an extent, studios sowed the seeds of their future because, in order to make a quick buck, virtually all of them began licensing their content to Netflix, often for multi-year contracts. While 2012's Lilyhammer was Netflix's first original show, it was House of Cards, just a year later, that really put Netflix on the map in terms of original content. Pour one out for Marco Polo, my favorite Netflix show that was unceremoniously cancelled after 2 seasons. But I digress. In 2013, just a month before House of Cards premiered, Ted Sarandos said, quote, "The goal is to become HBO faster than HBO can become us," end quote. That meant that Netflix's goal was to create award-winning original content, the kind that made HBO prestige TV, faster than HBO could make a strong move into the streaming space. By 2023, 10 years after House of Cards, Netflix's original content made up 55% of their library, with the remaining 45% being a mix of licensed content. Netflix ended 2013 with 41 million subscribers, and a decade later, at the end of 2023, they had 260 million. Netflix's rise must have been a shock to the system. The studios had sort of screwed themselves by licensing out their most valuable content to a competitor that pretty much snuck up on them. Netflix didn't compete with movie theaters directly because it has, so far, refused to release its movies in theaters beyond the bare minimum required to qualify for awards recognition. But it did keep people at home more often. Why go out to spend close to $100 for tickets for a family of 4 plus concessions when you could just enjoy that movie a little while later at home? Assailed as they were by Netflix, it would make sense that the entrenched players, Warner Brothers, Disney, Universal, Paramount, and others, would tap into what they had that was special, and that was copyright over libraries that were nearly 100 years old. These studios all had deep, rich histories which Netflix did not have. It also makes sense why sequel mania really got going in the 2010s. Netflix first launched streaming in January of 2007, and between the first announcement of a movie and its release, it usually takes around 2.5 years. The deluge of sequels were non-stop as we entered the new decade. Studios would continue to license these movies to Netflix until they decided that they wanted to release their own streaming services, leading to the landscape we have now. but by the time they were ready, Netflix had already weaned itself off of them. Now, the studios had to catch up to Netflix, which was bombarding users with new original content. Every week, something new comes to Netflix. It's a faster pace than pretty much any other studio. While streaming was on the ascent, studios decided to tap into two of the most powerful senses out there, something only they could provide: nostalgia and safety. Before we get too far, it's important to note that most movie releases are, in fact, original. Reboots, remakes, sequels, and prequels actually make up a pretty small portion of film releases, but are at this point the overwhelming victor in terms of box office receipts. Why? Because they provide a sense of nostalgia and safety. People are more willing to take a risk watching a new Netflix original movie because the monthly cost has already been factored in and they can stop watching it without risking too much time or investment. That's not the case with movies, where one could be out more than a month's worth of Netflix when factoring in ticket and concession prices. Even if you don't like the movie, you'll probably stick through to the end anyways because you already blew the money on it anyways. So what to do then? Retreat into the safety of the audience's childhood, of course. A lot of movies that were successful over the last decade, Jurassic World, Star Wars The Force Awakens, Top Gun Maverick, Toy Story 4, and so on, were released years, if not decades, after the previous installation in their series. And a lot of people that watched these movies were young when they watched those installations, maybe teens or even preteens. Those movies represented the proverbial good old days, a time when the world was much simpler and much more enjoyable because, as a kid, one's worries are significantly lessened. You don't have to deal with watching your parents age before your very eyes, no bills, little drama, and few responsibilities. The first movie I ever remember watching was Jurassic Park: The Lost World, and the T-Rex rampaging through San Diego will forever be etched in my memory. So when Jurassic World was going to come out, I knew I was going to go. But nostalgia and safety have one very effective countermeasure, and that is saturation. Nostalgia goes far, yes, but not at the expense of newness. The first video game I ever played was Pokemon Red, and I have very fond memories of it. I'll still play it here and there each year. But for the most part, I don't want to play the games of my childhood. I want to play what's going on now. Eventually, you get bored with the old because you're bombarded with it. Now, saturation by itself might not necessarily be a problem. The MCU had a decade-long run of very successful movies after all, sometimes with multiple releases a year. But saturation coupled with the decline in quality and a sense of homework will indeed kill the enjoyment one gets from movies. The MCU is the biggest offender for me here. The issue with creating a shared universe, like Marvel, is the issue people that read comics run into time and time again. Eventually, it all gets so bloated with so many crisscrossing continuities that you need a conspiracy board just to understand what the hell's going on. I was fine watching the Marvel movies, but when they started adding all the TV shows, my enjoyment lessened. Endgame had a mostly satisfying conclusion, and I think the wise move would have been to retire the MCU for a little bit to let people catch their breath. That doesn't mean stop making Marvel movies, but it does mean more single movies as opposed to a long-running series, something outside of the continuity. Jurassic World didn't have that problem, but rather a more fundamental one. Uninspiring, boring characters that were in the same room as dinosaurs but had no interesting interplay with them. The first Jurassic Park worked because it was much more visceral and the story was told from the standpoint of fear. The newer ones were much more cynical, but in a rather uninteresting way. Sure, they brought back Sam Neill, Laura Dern, and Jeff Goldblum to reprise their roles in Dominion, and the movie was a financial success, but it was uninteresting and unmemorable. Compared to Top Gun Maverick, released the same year. Maverick is one of the best films of the decade so far because it didn't just depend on callbacks to the first Top Gun. It didn't just rely on nostalgia. Maverick, unlike Jurassic World Dominion, grew up. The characters were complex and interesting, and while the plot was a bit generic, the movie was not worse off for it because it was about the characters, not the mission. The fundamental issue in quality is on stark display when you look at box office performance. While we would be remiss to not note the impact of the pandemic on the box office, even after it's largely over, the staggering decline in sequel performance is not wholly attributable to the pandemic. When Aquaman was released in 2018, it was a shocking success. I don't think anybody expected this movie to make more than $1.1 billion at the box office when Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice and Justice League failed at achieving that feat. I mean, come on. This was Aquaman. Aquaman. Who cared about Aquaman? No one. Still, it did the numbers. But when Aquaman 2 was released in 2023, it made just $434 million, a difference of more than $700 million. The sequel made $700 million less than the first one. That's not how it was for a large part of the 2010s. The sequels almost always made more, especially if it was a first or second sequel. Sure, sometimes there might be a bit of a drop-off, as was the case between Transformers Dark of the Moon and Age of Extinction, but a decline of $700 million is insane. Most movies don't even make that much. A lot of that might be attributable to the long delay between sequels, almost 5 years, during which the DCEU kept getting beaten down. But Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom and Jurassic World Dominion had a similar difference, 4 years, yet the decline was a much more modest $300 million. Still a significant amount to be sure, but less so. The poster child for declines, however, is another Disney property. Star Wars, and its decline is all pre-pandemic. Star Wars The Force Awakens was an absolute success, grossing more than $2 billion. But then something happened. Just a couple of years after its release, The Last Jedi suffered a precipitous fall, making $1.3 billion, more than $700 million fewer than its predecessor. Then, a couple of years after that, The Rise of Skywalker made just under $1.1 billion. The difference between The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker ended up being close to $1 billion. To put that in context, the lifetime gross for James Cameron's Avatar is $2.9 billion, while the gross for Avatar The Way of Water is $2.32 billion. Sure, it's a difference of just under $600 million, but they were also released 13 years apart. Considering that, it's amazing that the movie still managed to make more than $2 billion, despite people complaining about its supposed lack of impact. The sequel trilogy suffered from a lack of a coherent vision. While George Lucas didn't direct the entirety of the original trilogy, he was still a hands-on producer that was always on set for the production, and he was the singular guiding hand for the prequels irrespective of their issues. The sequel trilogy shifted between multiple directors that would be attached to, then leave projects, which doesn't exactly inspire confidence. Coupled with the flop that was Solo, Disney and Lucasfilm have had to do some soul-searching. It's been half a decade without a Star Wars movie at this point. There are several other examples too. The fall-off between Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, between On Stranger Tides and Dead Men Tell No Tales, between Age of Extinction and The Last Night, between The Hunger Games Catching Fire and literally every Hunger Games movie after it, and so on. Eventually, sequels hit a saturation point and people just get tired. This has happened to the MCU movies as well. Thor, Love and Thunder, Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 each made less than their predecessors. Not even the ever-popular Fast and Furious franchise is immune. Every Fast and Furious movie since The Fate of the Furious has made less than its predecessor, though the drop-offs aren't as steep as some others. The odd thing about all this is that it might be a good thing for movies in the long run. The media landscape of today resembles the landscape of the 1980s. The 80s were a period of consolidation, where movie studios were merging left and right, and there was an increasing emphasis on film franchises and sequels. Part of this was thanks to the creation of the blockbuster in the mid to late 70s and a newfound market segment in merchandise sales. But where there's commercialization, there's also dissatisfaction with the status quo. That, coupled with the rise of home media and the price of filmmaking coming down thanks to advancements in technology, meant that self-reliant filmmakers could start making their own movies. The 90s saw the rise of indie filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino, Kevin Smith, David Fincher, Spike Jonze, David O. Russell, Robert Rodriguez, and more. They worked with smaller budgets than blockbusters, but had interesting stories to tell that resonated with audiences. We're experiencing something like that now with the rise of independent producers and distributors like Neon and A24, as well as the resurgence of the director as the star. Neon and A24 make movies for cheap, but work with interesting directors that have something to say, while movies like Barbie, directed by Greta Gerwig, and Oppenheimer, directed by Christopher Nolan, have realigned the focus on the director, not the studio. For most of the 2010s, this was reversed. The studio was more associated with the movie than the director. It was a Marvel movie, not a Jon Favreau movie, or it was a Star Wars movie, not a J.J. Abrams movie. But recalibrating the focus to directors is, I think, a good thing, as they're the guiding hands of a film throughout its production. A director with interesting ideas will almost always make a better movie than entry number 4 of long-running franchise X. Hollywood has a lot of soul-searching to do, and I hope they make the right choice. Ease up on the sequels and stop trying to connect everything. Sometimes it's better to just give a director the creative freedom to make something interesting. It worked in the 90s, it can work in the 2020s.